Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Neeru Tandon from Department of English, VSSD College, Kanpur. We are discussing third paper, 19th century English literature. In it, this module has been written by Dr. Anjita Singh. It is on Swinburne. Swinburne was a poet, dramatist, novelist, and critic. He blended romantic and classical traditions beautifully. Revolutionary in selection of subject and expression as he was praised by many. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize for 6 years, 5 times consecutively. He took the literary scene by storm by his unconventional approach. He was born in London. His father was an admiral, son of a baronet. His mother was the daughter of an earl. He spent his childhood on the Isle of Wight, Northumberland. He developed a love for reading at a young age. He also developed nationalist feelings, and his schooling was majorly done at Eton, and he did his higher studies at Oxford. He had a highly excitable temperament. He was also an alcoholic. By nature, Swinburne was a nonconformist and unconventional. He created a pseudo-impression of himself as a homosexual and bestializer. He described as an algolanic. His untamed lifestyle brought him almost near death. He had taken charge of by his legal advisor, who kept him under supervision and care till his death in 1909. His college life needs to be discussed. He had great interest in studying Greek and Latin, and French and Italian literature and verse as well. He participated in literary competitions. He wrote some poetry imitating Pope. He grew friendship with the pre-Raphaelites and especially Rossetti and Maurice. He associated himself with the assassination attempt on Napoleon III, hence he was rusticated from his college. He left university without a degree. Many things influenced Swinburne. The first was literature, then the sea, then the nationalism, and the Bible. His early works comprises of The Queen, 1860, that was the drama, Rosamund in 1860 again, it was also a drama, and Chaste Land in 1865, which was the first play of a trilogy on Mary Queens of Scots. A lyrical drama published in 1865 by Swinburne known as Atalanta in Calydon that became quite famous, unanimously praised as Swinburne's best work. Written in the form of a Greek tragedy, people liked to go through it. He deliberately developed pagan notions which were placed in opposition to conventional religious ideas. The actual appeal of the work is in its meter and style of writing. He created a new world of sensuality and suggestiveness. He echoes Keats's plea for the pagan ideal of beauty. As Keats said, beauty is truth, truth is beauty. He also believed in the same thing. We are aware of the scholarship of Swinburne, his love for various languages, and his command over various languages was immense. So he wrote his poems though he had no college degree. Even then, that never mattered. He wrote so many poems and other dramas that he became a great writer of 19th century England. His collection of poems were there, and bold and frank expression of passion and sensuality were the main characteristics. He shocked and appalled the Victorian readers by its grossness and immoral attitude. There appeared a reflection of sadomasochism, explicitly sexual, perverted and blasphemous content was noticed. The unparalleled lyricism and metrical skill were its saving grace. He established the merit of Swinburne as a lyrical poet. In his middle period, Swinburne was recognized as the foremost poet of England. He got the recognition that he deserved. He turned to politics and philosophy for subjects. His poems were a celebration of liberty and humanism. Swinburne became severely addicted to alcohol by the age of 40. He was taken under care by Theodore Watts Dunton, who was his legal advisor. He lived at Watts Dunton's house, The Pines, for the rest of his life. He returned to literary world with Hepatologia or The Seven Against Sins in 1880, a series of parodies published anonymously. He sang of his love for the sea in Songs of Springtides and Studies in Song 1880. His metrical ingenuity and verbosity remained unparalleled. With advance in age, his language became slightly diffused. Other works of this period also needs mention, specifically Poems and Ballads, third series in 1889, A Midsummer Holiday 1884, A Tale of Balin in 1896, A Channel Passage 1904, The Sisters 1892, Rosamond Queen of the Lombards 1899, and The Duke of Gandia in 1908. Now, Swinburne's unique contribution to English verse forms has certain points, like a new verse form modeled on the French rondeau, a short poem of 3 stanzas. Each stanza consists of 3 lines, rhyme scheme ABA, BAB, ABA. Alternating rhyme scheme with an identical refrain at the end of the first and the last stanza was noticed. He dedicated his book, A Century of Roundels, in 1883 to Christina Rossetti. Swinburne was also recognized as a literary critic. His criticism of literature was praised by many. He wrote on various poets and writers. Marked by impulsiveness and inconsistency, his writing just created a debate. At times, he displayed erudition and zeal. He exaggerated praise or censure. He could not be considered a responsible or major critic. It is very important to go through the narrative technique of Swinburne. He was the master of bombast and rhetoric. He unordered verbal outburst. He was a poet of suggestion rather than exploration. He was extremely sensual, bordering on vulgarity. He was criticized for his florid style and condemned as superficial. He was credited for his brilliant command over rhyme. He boldly experimented with new forms. He stood up against the literary prudery of the Victorian age. Swinburne has been openly criticized for the florid style he has adopted and is condemned for being superficial, in that his diction is intended only for the sake of rhyme, of which he was a master, rather than having any profoundness of depth or meaning. Critics have summed up his contribution to literature as nothing, and are of the opinion that after the success of his early works like Atalanta, he was burdened with the responsibility of becoming the national poet of England for which he lacked ability. He is regarded as no more than a decadent poet. Now you see that Swinburne, who at the age of 40 became so alcoholic that his poetic abilities diminished. He was a frustrated person in his personal life, and that appeared in his literature as well. But his mastery of vocabulary, meter and rhyme is undeniable, and he is grudgingly given this credit by severe critics like A.E. Houseman. He finds a prominent place in George Saintsbury's History of English Prosody. Credit does go to him for the enrichment of English verse by his brilliant and effortless command over rhyme. He was considered the rhythmic master. His control over rhyme forced the critics to shut their mouth and consider him as a poet. The poem Hymn to Proserpine is quoted by Sue Bridgehead in Thomas Hardy's novel Jude the Obscure that made him famous, and people started recognizing it. To Swinburne, the sonnet was child's play. The task of providing 4 rhymes was not hard enough, and he wrote long poems in which each stanza required 8 or 10 rhymes, and wrote them so that he never seemed to be saying anything for the rhyme's sake. It was said by A.E. Houseman. Let us discuss his poem Hymn to Proserpine, which was published in 1866. The poem has a dual title in parenthesis. It was published in Poems and Ballads in the first series. The poem consists of 110 lines in the form of a dramatic monologue. Dramatic monologue is a type of poem in which the poetry is presented in the dramatic form. It can be said that it is a mixture of drama and poetic element. But when it is presented, the dramatic element is presented in the poetry, then it is termed as dramatic monologue, where it is monologue, one single speaker is presenting a dialogue and an imaginary reader or the listener is present there. A speaker here in this poem is an unnamed follower of paganism. This poem is about the speaker's undying belief in paganism even after it has been replaced by Christianity as the state religion. A speaker echoes the words of Julian in declaring the doom of Christianity. He depends technically on the use of paradox in language and thought. The reference to Proserpine, who is the Roman goddess of death, is metaphorical and symbolic. The paradoxical image of Proserpine, who occupies both the world of the dead and living and is the goddess of cyclic seasonal change, orders the thematic structure of the poem. The speaker's death wish relates to the mythology of Proserpine. His death wish just creates an atmosphere to go through. The poet stresses on the passage of time and the transience of every worldly order. Tone of the poem is irreverent towards Christianity. Diction and versification is pompous and grandiose. Sometimes it creates obscurity as well. The poem, I told you, that consists of 110 lines, and that depended technically on the evident use of a paradox. Poet has deliberately placed the figure of Proserpine at the beginning and at the end of the poem, making her a symbolic pattern for the poem, which concentrates in general on the cycle of nature and life, and in particular on the conversion from a pagan to a Christian Rome. Swinburne's diction and versification is typically characterized by pomposity and grandiosity. He has been overtly irreligious and irreverent. Next very important and debatable poem by Swinburne was named as Hermaphroditus, poem included in Poems and Ballads first series. Inspired by other poems, and Swinburne wrote this poem dated as for 1863. It was based on the Greek legend of Hermaphroditus, who was son of Hermes and Aphrodite, who was turned into an androgynous being by union with the water nymph Salmaex. Swinburne is fascinated by this perversion and grotesqueness in nature, and the poem is an attempt to explore this state. Before we go through the details of this poem, you must remember that Swinburne was a poet who wanted to show that he is homosexual, though he was not. He wanted to prove himself as a homosexual, and his repressed sexuality he expressed through various things. This poem is an example of that particular thing. The sexual ambiguity of Hermaphroditus has a poetic appeal for Swinburne, which he disconnects from the stuffy sexuality of the Victorians. The concept of the androgyne was a justified one for Swinburne, as he believed in a complete and perfect being undivided into male and female. This poem was one of the poems that created a debatable atmosphere in Victorian England. It was published in the first series, and with its publication, it was condemned as the most immoral and the most obscene book on poetry in the English language. And the thing to be noted is that it was deliberately done by Swinburne. Swinburne uses themes of sexual deviation without any equivocation, which was enough to shock the prudish readers of the age. The legend of Hermaphroditus owes its origin to Greek mythology, in which Swinburne had a remarkable absorption. The choice of subject matter, however, owes more to Swinburne's desire to explore taboo topics like sex, masochism, and the lure of the deviating sexual issues. Swinburne was fully aware of the Victorian concept of the perverted and grotesque in sexual and psychological terms. The sexual ambiguity of Hermaphroditus carries a poetic existence completely disconnected from the sexuality of Victorians, therefore becomes more furtively gratifying. In Greek mythology, the character of Hermaphroditus was believed to be the son of Hermes, but it was just inspired by the mother Aphrodite, who was the goddess of love and sex. Recounting the Hellenistic legend, Ovid narrates how the exceptionally handsome boy attracted the amorous attention of the water nymph, whose prayers for eternal union with him was granted when she embraced the boy and pulled him underwater, merging their bodies into one. Consequently, Hermaphroditus got transformed into an androgynous creature, a being with the figure and breast of a female and the sex organs of a male. Thus, the term hermaphrodite has come to mean a bisexual creature and symbolizes androgyny. It was a favorite subject in Greek art, though it did not have much importance as a cult. Swinburne uses the idea in a multi-layered connotative sense. Now you can just imagine that the society, Victorian society, which was so rigid about discussion of sex, discussion of morals, it was so strict that it never allowed and never welcomed the writers. And in such a society, when a writer like Swinburne presents such issues of minute details, he presents all these things with details and observations. He stormed the word, not only the literary word, but as well the social word. His concept of sex, of male and female being, was different from the then society. The poem is written as a sequence of 4 sonnets in the Petrarchan mold, with some variation in the rhyme scheme to suit the poet's treatment of subject. In the first sonnet, Swinburne has described everlasting internal struggle at the heart of a hermaphroditic experience. In this sonnet, the poet gives a hint of the grotesqueness and inadequacy of a hermaphrodite's love life, wherein it becomes suitable only for love that is blind to the sexual bipolarity and can choose of the 2 loves and cleave into the best. The frequent appearance of sexually perverted or ambiguous subject matter in the works of Swinburne is due to the irrepressible fascination he had for it. Somehow, his own personality and his own subconscious mind was responsible for this description. The concept of the androgyne was greatly justifiable to Swinburne, as he imagined a primordial sexlessness in man, and identified with the notion of the eternal androgyne, the human being who is complete and perfect, being undivided into male and female. The poem also contains pre-Raphaelite characteristics in the final rejection of the allure of sexual desire. The poem began with a strong sexual attraction towards the androgynous figure with its front turned away from sight, but ends with a sigh of futility. The rhyme scheme in the 4 sonnets follows the pattern ABBA, ABBA, CD, CD, CD. The changed rhyme pattern of the sestet from the traditional CDE, CDE is meant to suggest the sense of entanglement rather than progression. This poem, which was written in a sequence of 4 sonnets, and the successive sonnets analyze the inadequacy of a hermaphrodite's sexual life, the rejection and despair, amazement at the strange beauty of the body, and a mingled emotion of love and fear for the being, was something new for the Victorian society. The poem has a touch of the pre-Raphaelite in its imagery and in its final rejection of sexual desire. Now, what critics had to say about this poem is also important. What Oscar Wilde said, I will like to quote. He said, "Swinburne is a braggart in matters of vice who had done everything he could to convince his fellow citizens of his homosexuality and bestiality without being in the slightest degree a homosexual or a bestializer." Unquote. What A.E. Housman said, I quote, "To Swinburne, the sonnet was child's play." Unquote. To sum up, it can be said about Swinburne that he was a poet with a mastery over technique, over rhyme and rhyme scheme. But as far as his concern for sexual matters, his command over writing, and his bisexuality and his posing of homosexuality was under debate. He wanted that people should talk about him. His subconscious mind always played whenever he was there to write his poems, and that just presented him as a controversial figure in the Victorian society. He was different, he had certain qualities, but he was never praised, rather condemned. Thank you for visiting EPG Pathshala.